This is chapter 8 of Anglo's Saxon Boy by Tony Bradman, and it is called On Thorny Island. Hakon insisted they ride fully armed, even if it did mean the horses grew tired more quickly. Magnus didn't argue. He had been in one ambush on his trip to the north, and he had no desire to experience another. In the afternoon of the first day, they saw riders on a distant hill, a dozen warriors shadowing them. That night Hakon found an old Roman watchtower to camp in, its upper floors gone, but its walls solid. Magnus sat by the fire they had made on the flagstones inside the tower, stars twinkling in the square of dark sky above them. They had posted guards, and the rest of the men were taking their ease, quietly talking, some sleeping, like Hakon beside him. But Magnus couldn't relax, and stared into the flames, dwelling on what he had seen in the north, trying to make up his mind what to say to his father. It should have been easy. He could simply report that Tostig had got himself into a terrible mess and tell his father what Edwin was plotting, although Magnus had a feeling Eldred had already made his father aware of all that in his letter. Magnus could add detail and pass on Eldred's message about time running out, of course, but anybody else could have done as much. So his father must have sent him to York for a different reason, and suddenly Magnus realised what it was. The whole thing was a test of whether he could be his father's heir, a son who would one day be a king. His father wanted him to do more than simply report back on what was happening in the north. He wanted Magnus to work out what they should do, to show he could think about problems and tactics and come up with answers. But that was hard, especially as he didn't understand part of it. "Wake up, Hakon," he said, nudging the housecarl with his boot. "I need to ask you something. Do you think King Edward knows what Edwin is doing?" "Probably," Hakon said without opening his eyes. "The king's court is full of priests, and Eldred is bound to have friends among them. People say he is as thick as thieves with Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the king's favourite. So why doesn't the king stop Edwin? He made my uncle Earl of Northumbria, and Edwin Earl of Mercia. Surely he doesn't want his earls to fight each other." Hakon sighed and opened his eyes. "He's a weak king, Magnus, only interested in praying. He'll let the earls do what they please so long as whoever ends up top dog stays loyal to him, and gives him plenty of gold so he can build more churches." "I have another question," Magnus said. "How many housecarls would my uncle need to defeat Edwin? I mean properly, so he wouldn't be a threat anymore." "Your father has 1,000, said Hakon, "but 500 should do it." "Would you fight for my uncle? If he got rid of his bought men, that is." "I am your father's sworn man, and I do whatever he bids me. So yes, I would fight for Tostig if that was your father's wish. Can I go back to sleep now?" "Only if you tell me why you stood up to Eldred for my uncle like that." "Because it's true. Your uncle is a great warrior, even if he is making a mess of things. And I hate priests. They're supposed to be good, but most are full of lies and just as greedy for gold and power as other men. Sleep well, Magnus." In fact, Magnus slept better that night than he had done for many days. He knew what he was going to say now, and he was sure his father would agree. The warriors shadowing them disappeared once Magnus and his men crossed back into Mercia, and the rest of the ride was as quiet as the journey to the north had been. After 15 days they entered the courtyard of the Godwin farm, only to discover Earl Harold was no longer there. He had been summoned by King Edward not long after they had set out for York, and had left word that they should follow him. 4 days later, Magnus led his men along the last stretch of the road to Thorny Island, the site of King Edward's palace. It was raining steadily, clouds hanging like giant sodden fleeces above their heads, and they were soaked. A wooden gate barred their way onto the bridge across the narrow tributary that separated the island from the north bank of the Thames, but it was guarded by more of his father's housecarls, who recognised Magnus and Hakon and waved them through. Magnus had been to Thorny Island with his father several years ago. King Edward's palace was the same as he remembered, the hall even bigger than the one at Godwin Farm. A host of lesser buildings clustered around it. But since Magnus's last visit, the king had ordered the building of a vast new church to replace the island's old abbey, and it was almost finished. Thorney was a few miles west of London, a city even bigger than York. People had started calling St Paul's, London's largest church, the Eastminster, and the King's New Church, the Westminster, or Westminster Abbey. Magnus sent his men off to get dry and fed, while he and Hakon made their way to the hall down a muddy street past a tavern, a big smithy, and the huts of King Edward's servants. Rain dripped off the thatched roofs, and there were so many big puddles Magnus thought it was almost as if the island was sinking into the river. At last, they left their horses with the housecarls guarding the hall's great entrance and went inside. The hall was enormous, its giant roof beams impossibly high. Grey, watery light seeped in through the tall windows along the side walls. Magnus and Hakon walked its length, their steps echoing off the stone floor, and past nobles and priests huddled together, whispering. Hakon scowled, and most stepped backwards, giving him plenty of room, although a few stared at him with contempt. "We are the ones who rule here, not you lowly warriors," their sneer seemed to say. King Edward was at the far end of the hall, sitting on his throne. Magnus was shocked to see how ill the king looked. He was old, but he was deathly pale too, his cheeks sunken, his eyes red and rheumy beneath the circle of fine gold he wore on his wrinkled brow. His tunic was simple, but made of the best cloth, and a heavy gold cross hung on a chain around his thin neck. Earl Harold was speaking to the king, leaning in very close to whisper into his ear. Then the earl spotted Magnus and gestured for him to come forward. Magnus knelt before the king and bowed his head. "You remember my son, Magnus, my lord?" said the earl, stepping back from his throne. "He has just returned from visiting his uncle Tostig in the north." "Your son, you say?" The king spoke in a soft whisper. "You Godwins all look alike to me. There are so many of you, but I am very fond of Tostig. How is he?" "He is well, my lord," said Magnus, glancing at his father. Suddenly the king started to cough, his thin chest heaving, and monks fussed around him. "I fear we are tiring you, my lord," said the earl. "May we take our leave?" King Edward nodded and waved them away, still coughing, his face red. The earl led Magnus and Hakon outside to a garden beside the wide river. He stopped by an ancient oak and turned to face Magnus, Hakon hanging back. The rain had stopped, but a cool breeze ruffled the water. "So, my brother is well, is he?" said the earl. "Tell me more, Magnus." It didn't take long for Magnus to make his report. He told his father what he had seen and heard, leaving nothing out, and said that Tostig would certainly lose his earldom unless they helped him. "He needs more men, father, real warriors, not the cowards he pays to burn farms. Hakon reckons 500 of your housecarls could easily beat Edwin's men. Then we Godwins will keep control of Northumbria." The earl looked at him for a moment, then smiled and squeezed his shoulder. "Well done, Magnus," he said. "I will think about all that you have told me." Magnus smiled, but in his heart he had hoped for more.